Ridley Scott's gritty Gladiator 2, the sequel to 2000's legendary Gladiator, is coming to cinemas this year. We wondered what life was actually like for the gladiators. Do you want to know? So let's go. The earliest types of gladiator were named after Rome's enemies of that time: the Samnite, Thracian, and Gaul. The Samnite, heavily armed, elegantly helmed, and probably the most popular type, was renamed Secutor, and the Gaul renamed Myrmillo. Once these former enemies had been conquered, then absorbed into Rome's empire. In the mid-Republican Munus, each type seems to have fought against a similar or identical type. In the later Republic and early Empire, various fantasy types were introduced and were set against dissimilar but complementary types. For example, the bare-headed, nimble retiarius, Netman, armored only at the left arm and shoulder, pitted his net, trident, and dagger against the more heavily armored, helmeted Secutor. Most depictions of gladiators show the most common and popular types. Passing literary references to others has allowed their tentative reconstruction. Other novelties introduced around this time included gladiators who fought from chariots or carts or from horseback. At an unknown date, cestus fighters were introduced to Roman arenas, probably from Greece, armed with potentially lethal boxing sloves. The trade in gladiators was empire-wide and subjected to official supervision. Rome's military success produced a supply of soldier prisoners who were redistributed for use in state mines or amphitheaters and for sale on the open market. For example, in the aftermath of the Jewish revolt, the gladiator schools received an influx of Jews. Those rejected for training would have been sent straight to the arenas as noxi, lit, hurtful ones. The best, the most robust, were sent to Rome. In Rome's military ethos, enemy soldiers who had surrendered or allowed their own capture and enslavement had been granted an unmerited gift of life. Their training as gladiators would give them opportunity to redeem their honor in the Munus. Two other sources of gladiators, found increasingly during the Principate and the relatively low military activity of the Pax Romana, were slaves condemned to the arena, damnati, to gladiator schools or games, ad ludum gladiatorium, as punishment for crimes, and the paid volunteers, auctorati, who by the late Republic may have comprised approximately half, and possibly the most capable half, of all gladiators. The use of volunteers had a precedent in the Iberian Munus of Scipio Africanus, but none of those had been paid. For the poor and for non-citizens, enrollment in a gladiator school offered a trade, regular food, housing of sorts, and a fighting chance of fame and fortune. Mark Antony chose a troop of gladiators to be his personal bodyguard. Gladiators customarily kept their prize money and any gifts they received, and these could be substantial. Tiberius offered several retired gladiators 100,000 sesterces each to return to the arena. Nero gave the gladiator spiculous property and residence equal to those of men who had celebrated triumphs. From the 60s, AD female gladiators appear as rare and exotic markers of exceptionally lavish spectacle. In 66 AD, Nero had Ethiopian women, men, and children fight at a Munus to impress the king Tiridates I of Armenia. Romans seem to have found the idea of a female gladiator novel and entertaining, or downright absurd. Juvenal titillates his readers with a woman named Mavia, hunting boars in the arena with spear in hand and breasts exposed, and Petronius mocks the pretensions of a rich, low-class citizen whose Munus includes a woman fighting from a cart or chariot. A Munus of 89 AD during Domitian's reign featured a battle between female gladiators described as Amazons. In Halicarnassus, a 2nd century AD relief depicts two female combatants named Amazon and Achillea. Their match ended in a draw. In the same censure, female gladiators probably submitted to the same regulations and training as their male counterparts. Roman morality required that all gladiators be of the lowest social classes, and emperors who failed to respect this distinction earned the scorn of posterity. Cassius Dio takes pains to point out that when the much-admired Emperor Titus used female gladiators, they were of acceptably low class. Some regarded female gladiators of any type or class as a symptom of corrupted Roman appetites, morals, and womanhood. Before he became emperor, Septimius Severus may have attended the Antiochene Olympic Games, which had been revived by the Emperor Commodus and included traditional Greek female athletics. Septimius's attempt to give Rome a similarly dignified display of female athletics was met by the crowd with ribald chants and catcalls. Probably as a result, he banned the use of female gladiators in 200 AD. Caligula, Titus, Hadrian, Lucius Verus, Caracalla, Geta, and Didius Julianus were all said to have performed in the arena, either in public or private, but risks to themselves were minimal. Claudius, characterized by his historians as morbidly cruel and boorish, fought a whale trapped in the harbor in front of a group of spectators. Commentators invariably disapproved of such performances. Commodus was a fanatical participant at the Ludi and compelled Rome's elite to attend his performances as gladiator, bestiarius, or venator. Most of his performances as a gladiator were bloodless affairs, fought with wooden swords. He invariably won. He was said to have restyled Nero's colossal statue in his own image as Hercules Reborn, dedicated to himself as champion of secutores, only left-handed fighter to conquer 12 times 1,000 men. He was said to have killed 100 lions in one day, almost certainly from an elevated platform surrounding the arena perimeter, which allowed him to safely demonstrate his marksmanship. On another occasion, he decapitated a running ostrich with a specially designed dart, carried the bloodied head and his sword over to the senatorial seats, and gesticulated as though they were next. As reward for these services, he drew a gigantic stipend from the public purse. Gladiator games were advertised well beforehand, on billboards that gave the reason for the game, its editor, venue, date, and the number of paired gladiators, ordinarii, to be used. Other highlighted features could include details of venations, executions, music, and any luxuries to be provided for the spectators, such as an awning against the sun, water sprinklers, food, drink, sweets, and occasionally door prizes. For enthusiasts and gamblers, a more detailed program, libellus, was distributed on the day of the munus, showing the names, types, and match records of gladiator pairs and their order of appearance. Left-handed gladiators were advertised as a rarity. They were trained to fight right-handers, which gave them an advantage over most opponents and produced an interestingly unorthodox combination. The night before the munus, the gladiators were given a banquet and opportunity to order their personal and private affairs. Futrell notes its similarity to a ritualistic or sacramental last meal. 89. These were probably both family and public events, which included even the Noxii, sentenced to die in the arena the following day, and the Damnati, who would have at least a slender chance of survival. The event may also have been used to drum up more publicity for the imminent game. The gladiators may have held informal warm-up matches, using blunted or dummy weapons. Some munera, however, may have used blunted weapons throughout. The editor, his representative, or an honored guest would check the weapons, probatio armorum, for the scheduled matches. These were the highlight of the day, and were as inventive, varied, and novel as the editor could afford. Armatures could be very costly. Some were flamboyantly decorated with exotic feathers, jewels, and precious metals. Increasingly, the munus was the editor's gift to spectators who had come to expect the best as their due. Lightly armed and armored fighters, such as the retiarius, would tire less rapidly than their heavily armed opponents. Most bouts would have lasted 10 to 15 minutes, or 20 minutes at most. In late Republican Munera, between 10 and 13 matches could have been fought on one day. This assumes one match at a time in the course of an afternoon. Spectators preferred to watch highly skilled, well-matched ordinarii with complementary fighting styles. These were the most costly to train and to hire. A general melee of several lower-skilled gladiators was far less costly, but also less popular. Even among the ordinary eye, match winners might have to fight a new, well-rested opponent, either a tertiarius, third-choice gladiator by prearrangement, or a substitute gladiator, suppositicius, who fought at the whim of the editor as an unadvertised, unexpected extra SD. This yielded 2 combats for the cost of 3 gladiators, rather than 4. Such contests were prolonged, and in some cases, more bloody. Most were probably of poor quality, but the Emperor Caracalla chose to test a notably skilled and successful fighter named Bato against first one Suppositidius, whom he beat, and then another who killed him. At the opposite level of the profession, a gladiator reluctant to confront his opponent might be whipped or goaded with hot irons until he engaged through sheer desperation. Combats between experienced, well-trained gladiators demonstrated a considerable degree of stagecraft. Among the cognoscenti, bravado and skill in combat were esteemed over mere hacking and bloodshed. Some gladiators made their careers and reputation from bloodless victories. Suetonius describes an exceptional munus by Nero, in which no one was killed, not even noxi, enemies of the state. Trained gladiators were expected to observe professional rules of combat. Most matches employed a senior referee, some erudis, and an assistant, shown in mosaics with long staffs, rudes, to caution or separate opponents at some crucial point in the match. Referees were usually retired gladiators whose decisions, judgment, and discretion were, for the most part, respected. They could stop bouts entirely, or pause them to allow the combatants rest, refreshment, and a rub-down. Ludi and munera were accompanied by music, played as interludes, or building to a frenzied crescendo during combats, perhaps to heighten the suspense during a gladiator's appeal. Blows may have been accompanied by trumpet blasts. The Zelitan mosaic in Libya, circa 80–100 AD, shows musicians playing an accompaniment to provincial games, with gladiators, bestiari, or venatores and prisoners, attacked by beasts. Their instruments are a long, straight trumpet, tubicen, a large curved horn, cornu, and a water organ, hydraulis. Similar representations, musicians, gladiators, and bestiari, are found on a tomb relief in Pompeii. A match was won by the gladiator who overcame his opponent or killed him outright. Victors received the palm branch and an award from the editor. An outstanding fighter might receive a laurel crown and money from an appreciative crowd. But for anyone originally condemned ad ludum, the greatest reward was manumission, emancipation, symbolized by the gift of a wooden training sword or staff, rudis, from the editor. Martial describes a match between Priscus and Verus, who fought so evenly and bravely for so long that when both acknowledged defeat at the same instant, Titus awarded victory and a rudis to each. Flamma was awarded the rudis 4 times, but chose to remain a gladiator. His gravestone in Sicily includes his record. Flamma Secutor lived 30 years, fought 34 times, won 21 times, fought to a draw 9 times, defeated 4 times, Assyrian by nationality. Delicatus made this for his deserving comrade in arms. A gladiator could acknowledge defeat by raising a finger, ad digitum, in appeal to the referee to stop the combat, and refer to the editor, whose decision would usually rest on the crowd's response. In the earliest munera, death was considered a righteous penalty for defeat. Later, those who fought well might be granted remission at the whim of the crowd or the editor. During the imperial era, matches advertised as sine missione, usually understood to mean without reprieve for the defeated, suggest that missio, the sparing of a defeated gladiator's life, had become common practice. The contract between editor and his lanista could include compensation for unexpected deaths. This could be some 50 times higher than the lease price of the gladiator. Under Augustus's rule, the demand for gladiators began to exceed supply, and matches sine missione were officially banned, an economical, pragmatic development that happened to match popular notions of natural justice. When Caligula and Claudius refused to spare defeated but popular fighters, Their own popularity suffered. In general, gladiators who fought well were likely to survive. At a Pompeian match between chariot fighters, Publius Ostorius, with previous 51 wins to his credit, was granted missio after losing to Scylax, with 26 victories. By common custom, the spectators decided whether or not a losing gladiator should be spared and chose the winner in the rare event of a standing tie. Even more rarely, perhaps uniquely, one stalemate ended in the killing of one gladiator by the editor himself. In any event, the final decision of death or life belonged to the editor, who signaled his choice with a gesture described by Roman sources as pollice verso, meaning with a turned thumb, a description too imprecise for reconstruction of the gesture or its symbolism. Whether victorious or defeated, a gladiator was bound by oath to accept or implement his editor's decision, the victor being nothing but the instrument of his editor's will. Not all editors chose to go with the crowd, and not all those condemned to death for putting on a poor show chose to submit. Once a band of 5 retiari in tunics, matched against the same number of secutores, yielded without a struggle, but when their death was ordered, one of them caught up his trident and slew all the victors. Caligula bewailed this in a public proclamation as a most cruel murder. The earliest named gladiator school, singular ludus, plural ludi, is that of Aurelius Scaurus at Capua. He was lanista of the gladiators employed by the state circa 105 BC to instruct the legions and simultaneously entertain the public. Few other lanistae are known by name. They headed their familia gladiatoria and had lawful power over life and death of every family member, including servi poenae, auctorati, and ancillaries. Socially, they were infames, on a footing with pimps and butchers, and despised as price gougers. No such stigma was attached to a gladiator owner, monerarius, or editor of good family, high status, and independent means. Cicero congratulated his friend Atticus on buying a splendid troupe. If he rented them out, he might recover their entire cost after 2 performances. The Spartacus revolt had originated in a gladiator school privately owned by Lentulus Batiatus, and had been suppressed only after a protracted series of costly, sometimes disastrous campaigns by regular Roman troops. In the late Republican era, a fear of similar uprisings, the usefulness of gladiator schools in creating private armies, and the exploitation of munera for political gain led to increased restrictions on gladiator school ownership, siting, and organization. By Domitian's time, many had been more or less absorbed by the state, including those at Pergamum, Alexandria, Praeneste, and Capua. The city of Rome itself had 4: the Ludus Magnus, the largest and most important, housing up to about 2,000 gladiators, Ludus Dacicus, Ludus Gallicus, and the Ludus Matutinus, which trained bestiarii. In the imperial era, volunteers required a magistrate's permission to join a school as auctorati. If this was granted, the school's physician assessed their suitability. Their contract, auctoramentum, stipulated how often they were to perform, their fighting style and earnings. A condemned bankrupt or debtor accepted as novice, novitius, could negotiate with his lanista or editor for the partial or complete payment of his debt. Faced with runaway re-enlistment fees for skilled auctorati, Marcus Aurelius set their upper limit at 12,000 sesterces. All prospective gladiators, whether volunteer or condemned, were bound to service by a sacred oath, sacramentum. Novices, novicii, trained under teachers of particular fighting styles, probably retired gladiators. They could ascend through a hierarchy of grades, singular, palus, in which primus palus was the highest. Lethal weapons were prohibited in the schools. Weighted, blunt wooden versions were probably used. Fighting styles were probably learned through constant rehearsal as choreographed numbers. An elegant, economical style was preferred. Training included preparation for a stoical, unflinching death. Successful training required intense commitment. Those condemned ad ludum were probably branded or marked with a tattoo, stigma, plural stigmata, on the face, legs, and/or hands. These stigmata may have been text, Slaves were sometimes thus marked on the forehead until Constantine banned the use of facial stigmata in 325 AD. Soldiers were routinely marked on the hand. Gladiators were typically accommodated in cells, arranged in barrack formation around a central practice arena. Juvenal describes the segregation of gladiators according to type and status, suggestive of rigid hierarchies within the schools. Even the lowest scum of the arena observe this rule. Even in prison, they're separate. Retiari were kept away from damnati, and fag targeteers from armored heavies. As most ordinary at games were from the same school, this kept potential opponents separate and safe from each other until the lawful munus. Discipline could be extreme, even lethal. Remains of a Pompeian ludus site attest to developments in supply, demand, and discipline. In its earliest phase, the building could accommodate 15-20 gladiators. Its replacement could have housed about 100 and included a very small cell, probably for lesser punishments and so low that standing was impossible. Despite the harsh discipline, gladiators represented a substantial investment for their lanista and were otherwise well-fed and cared for. Their daily, high-energy vegetarian diet consisted of barley, boiled beans, oatmeal, ash, and dried fruit. Gladiators were sometimes called hordiarii, eaters of barley. Romans considered barley inferior to wheat. A punishment for legionaries replaced their wheat ration with it, but it was thought to strengthen the body. Regular massage and high-quality medical care helped mitigate an otherwise very severe training regimen. Part of Galen's medical training was at a gladiator school in Pergamum, where he saw, and would later criticize, the training, diet, and long-term health prospects of the gladiators. Early literary sources seldom agree on the origins of gladiators and the gladiator game. In the late 1st century BC, Nicholas of Damascus believed they were Etruscan. A generation later, Livy wrote that they were first held in 310 BC by the Campanians in celebration of their victory over the Samnites. Long after the games had ceased, the 7th century AD writer Isidore of Seville derived Latin lanista, manager of gladiators, from the Etruscan word for executioner and the title of charon, an official who accompanied the dead from the Roman gladiatorial arena. From charoon, psychopomp of the Etruscan underworld. This was accepted and repeated in most early modern standard histories of the games. For some modern scholars, reappraisal of pictorial evidence supports a Campanian origin, or at least a borrowing, for the games and gladiators. Campania hosted the earliest known gladiator schools, ludi. Tomb frescoes from the Campanian city of Paestum, 4th century BC, show paired fighters with helmets, spears, and shields in a propitiatory funeral blood rite that anticipates early Roman gladiator games. Compared to these images, supporting evidence from Etruscan tomb paintings is tentative and late. The Paestum frescoes may represent the continuation of a much older tradition, acquired or inherited from Greek colonists of the 8th century BC. Livy places the first Roman gladiator games, 264 BC, in the early stage of Rome's First Punic War against Carthage, when Decimus Junius Brutus Sceva had 3 gladiator pairs fight to the death in Rome's cattle market forum, Forum Boarium, to honor his dead father, Brutus Pera. Livy describes this as a munus, plural, munera, a gift, in this case, a commemorative duty owed the manes, spirit, or shade, of a dead ancestor by his descendants. The development of the gladiator munus and its gladiator types was most strongly influenced by Samnium's support for Hannibal and the subsequent punitive expeditions against the Samnites by Rome and its Campanian allies. The earliest, most frequently mentioned and probably most popular type was the Samnite. The war in Samnium, immediately afterwards, was attended with equal danger and an equally glorious conclusion. The enemy, besides their other warlike preparation, had made their battle line to glitter with new and splendid arms. There were 2 corps. The shields of the one were inlaid with gold, of the other with silver. The Romans had already heard of these splendid accoutrements. But their generals had taught them that a soldier should be rough to look on, not adorned with gold and silver, but putting his trust in iron and in courage. The dictator, as decreed by the Senate, celebrated a triumph in which by far the finest show was afforded by the captured armor. So, the Romans made use of the splendid armor of their enemies to do honor to their gods, while the Campanians, in consequence of their pride and in hatred of the Samnites, equipped after this fashion the gladiators who furnished them entertainment at their feasts, and bestowed on them the name Samnites. Livy's account skirts the funereal, sacrificial function of early Roman gladiator combats and reflects the later theatrical ethos of the Roman gladiator show. Splendidly exotically armed and armored barbarians, treacherous and degenerate, are dominated by Roman iron and native courage. His plain Romans virtuously dedicate the magnificent spoils of war to the gods. Their Campanian allies stage a dinner entertainment using gladiators who may not be Samnites, but play the Samnite role. Other groups and tribes would join the cast list as Roman territories expanded. Most gladiators were armed and armored in the manner of the enemies of Rome. The gladiator munus became a morally instructive form of historic enactment in which the only honorable option for the gladiator was to fight well or else die well. The enthusiastic adoption of gladiatoria munera by Rome's Iberian allies shows how easily and how early the culture of the gladiator munus permeated places far from Rome itself. By 174 BC, small Roman munera, private or public, provided by an editor of relatively low importance, may have been so commonplace and unremarkable they were not considered worth recording. Many gladiatorial games were given in that year, some unimportant, one noteworthy, beyond the rest. That of Titus Flamininus, which he gave to commemorate the death of his father, which lasted 4 days, and was accompanied by a public distribution of meats, a banquet, and scenic performances. The climax of the show, which was big for the time, was that in 3 days, 74 gladiators fought. In 105 BC, the ruling consuls offered Rome its first taste of state-sponsored barbarian combat, demonstrated by gladiators from Capua, as part of a training program for the military. It proved immensely popular. Thereafter, the gladiator contests formerly restricted to private munera were often included in the state games, ludi, that accompanied the major religious festivals. Where traditional ludi had been dedicated to a deity, such as Jupiter, the munera could be dedicated to an aristocratic sponsor's divine or heroic ancestor. Gladiatorial games offered their sponsors extravagantly expensive but effective opportunities for self-promotion and gave their clients and potential voters exciting entertainment at little or no cost to themselves. Gladiators became big business for trainers and owners, for politicians on the make, and those who had reached the top and wished to stay there. A politically ambitious privatus, private citizen, might postpone his deceased father's munus to the election season, when a generous show might drum up votes. Those in power and those seeking it needed the support of the plebeians and their tribunes, whose votes might be won with the mere promise of an exceptionally good show. Sulla, during his term as praetor, showed his usual acumen in breaking his own sumptuary laws to give the most lavish munus yet seen in Rome for the funeral of his wife, Metella. In the closing years of the politically and socially unstable late Republic, any aristocratic owner of gladiators had political muscle at his disposal. In 65 BC, newly elected curule aedile Julius Caesar held games that he justified as munus to his father, who had been dead for 20 years. Despite an already enormous personal debt, he used 320 gladiator pairs in silvered armor. He had more available in Capua, but the Senate, mindful of the recent Spartacus revolt and fearful of Caesar's burgeoning private armies and rising popularity, imposed a limit of 320 pairs as the maximum number of gladiators any citizen could keep in Rome. Caesar's showmanship was unprecedented in scale and expense. He had staged a munus as memorial rather than funeral rite, eroding any practical or meaningful distinction between munus and ludi. Gladiatorial games, usually linked with beast shows, spread throughout the Republic and beyond. Anti-corruption laws of 65 and 63 BC attempted but failed to curb the political usefulness of the games to their sponsors. Following Caesar's assassination and the Roman Civil War, Augustus assumed imperial authority over the games, including munera, and formalized their provision as a civic and religious duty. His revision of sumptuary law capped private and public expenditure on munera, claiming to save the Roman elite from the bankruptcies they would otherwise suffer, and restricting gladiator munera to the festivals of Saturnalia and Quinquatria. Henceforth, an imperial praetor's official munus was allowed a maximum of 120 gladiators at a ceiling cost of 25,000 denarii. An imperial ludi might cost no less than 180,000 denarii. Throughout the empire, the greatest and most celebrated games would now be identified with the state-sponsored imperial cult, which furthered public recognition, respect, and approval for the emperor's divine numen, his laws, and his agents. Between 108 and 109 AD, Trajan celebrated his Dacian victories, using a reported 10,000 gladiators and 11,000 animals over 123 days. The cost of gladiators and munera continued to spiral out of control. Legislation of 177 AD by Marcus Aurelius did little to stop it, and was completely ignored by his son, Commodus. Dear, thanks for listening. We are close to end. Are you hungry for more? Give a like and subscribe. So see you later.
Sources of information and the books you may read and also enjoy. Auget Roland, 1994. Cruelty and Civilization, The Roman Games. Bagnani, Gilbert, January 1956. Encolpius Gladiator Obscenus. Ball, Warwick, 2016. Rome in the East, Transformation of an Empire. Second editor. Barton, Carlin A., 1993. The Sorrows of the Ancient Romans. The Gladiator and the Monster. Borkowski, J. Andrew, Duplessis, Paul J., 2005. Textbook on Roman Law. Brunette, Stephen, 2014. Women with Swords, Female Gladiators in the Roman World. Carter, Michael, 2004. Archires and Asiarchs, A Gladiatorial Perspective. Coleman, K.M., 1990. Fatal Charades, Roman Executions Staged as Mythological Enactments. Edwards, Catherine, 2007. Death in Ancient Rome. Everett, Anthony, 2001. Cicero, The Life and Times of Rome's Greatest Politician. Fagan, Garrett G., The Lure of the Arena. Social Psychology and the Crowd at the Roman Games. Fox, Robin Lane, 2006. The Classical World, An Epic History from Homer to Hadrian. Futrell, Allison, 2006. A Sourcebook on the Roman Games. Gibbon, Edward. Womersley, David, 2000. The History of the Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. Grant, Michael, 2000. Gladiators. Grossschmidt, K. Kanz, Fabian, July 2006. Head Injuries of Roman Gladiators. Hopkins, Keith, Beard, Mary, 2005. The Colosseum. Jacobelli, Luciana, 2003. Gladiators at Pompeii. Jones, C.P., 1987. Stigma, Tattooing and Branding in Graeco-Roman Antiquity. Junkelmann, Markus, 2000. Das Spiel mit dem Tod, so kämpften Roms Gladiatoren. Köhne, Eckart, Ewigleben, Cornelia, Jackson, Ralph, 2000. Gladiators and Caesars, The Power of Spectacle in Ancient Rome. Kyle, Donald G., 1998. Spectacles of Death in Ancient Rome. Kyle, Donald G., 2007. Sport and Spectacle in the Ancient World. Lintott, Andrew, 2004. The Constitution of the Roman Republic. Mattern, Susan P., 2002. Rome and the Enemy. Imperial Strategy in the Principate.